Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My cousin Lyle had been living out past Pine Hollow for years before that spring flood came through and nearly swallowed half the ridge. The trailer he'd called home sat about 10 winding miles off the main road, tucked behind what used to be an old coal transport line that nobody maintained anymore. After the flood turned the ground into a muddy mess and made the whole place feel cursed, Lyle packed up what mattered and moved closer to civilization. He gave up on the property. Said it was more trouble than it was worth trying to keep it standing. But he still had things out there that needed protecting. Tools, mostly. Some hunting gear. An old generator he swore still worked. He asked if I'd drive up once a month just to check on the place, make sure nobody was squatting inside or stripping it for scrap metal. I didn't mind doing him the favor. Lyle had always looked out for me when we were growing up. Taken the blame for things I'd done, taught me how to field dress a deer, let me stay at his place when my own home situation got too heavy. Driving out there once a month seemed like a small price to pay. Plus, it gave me an excuse to get out of the house, drink coffee from a thermos like some old-timer, and spend a few hours alone with my thoughts. The drive was long and rough, but I didn't mind that either. There was something peaceful about being that far removed from everything. The road out to Lyle's place wasn't on any map you'd find online. You had to know where to turn, and even then, the gravel path twisted around the ridge in ways that made you second-guess whether you were still headed in the right direction. Cell signal dropped out about halfway up, so no GPS, no phone calls, just you and whatever lived in those woods. I'd made the trip 4 or 5 times by then, always during the day, always without incident. It had become routine. Park the truck, hike up the short path, check the propane tank, make sure the door was still locked, and then head back down. Easy. That particular visit started the same way it always did. I loaded a gas can into the truck bed, filled my thermos with black coffee, and headed out around 9 in the morning. The weather was cool but clear, the kind of day where the sun cuts through the trees just right and makes everything look clean. I didn't expect anything weird. There'd never been a problem before, but when I got to the gate, something felt off right away. The chain that usually kept it locked was hanging loose, swinging a little in the breeze. Not snapped, not cut, just unhooked like someone had opened it and didn't bother to close it behind them. I pulled the truck up slow and rolled down the window, staring at that chain for a long moment. My first thought was that maybe Lyle had come up here without telling me. He wasn't great at keeping me in the loop, and it wouldn't have been the first time he'd forgotten to mention a trip. I checked the gravel around the post, looking for fresh tire tracks or boot prints, but there was nothing. The dust was thick and undisturbed, like nobody had driven through in weeks. Still, I convinced myself it had to be him. Maybe he'd walked up from a different access point, or maybe the wind had knocked the chain loose somehow, even though that didn't make much sense. I got out, relatched the chain, and started the short hike up to the trailer. The path was steep in places, overgrown with weeds that grabbed at my jeans. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, familiar and comforting in a way that made me relax a little. The trailer came into view after a few minutes, sitting there like it always did, sagging slightly to one side, its once white siding now streaked with rust and mildew. The porch looked mostly the same, except for one thing. One of the 2 plastic chairs that Lyle always kept out front was missing. The other chair was still there, sun-faded and cracked down the back. But the second one, the one Lyle liked to sit in while he smoked, was gone. I stood at the bottom of the steps and scanned the area, thinking maybe it had blown off the porch during a storm, but there was no sign of it anywhere nearby. I filed it away as strange, but not alarming. Maybe Lyle had taken it with him when he moved. Maybe it had finally broken and he'd tossed it. Inside, the trailer smelled exactly the way I remembered. Stale pine cleaner layered over a faint mildew smell that never quite went away, no matter how many times you aired the place out. I flipped on the battery-powered lamp I always brought and started my usual checks. The propane tank was fine, still half full. The water hookup hadn't been touched. The paneling along the back wall, which had warped a bit during the flood, looked the same as it had last time. Everything seemed normal until I noticed the boots. Lyle always kept one pair of rubber boots by the back door. Black ones with worn-out heels that he'd had for years. That day, there were 2 pairs. The second pair was newer, a different style, with cleaner soles and a faint plastic smell still hanging around them like they hadn't seen much use. I stood there staring at them, hands still pressed against the wall, trying to figure out what I was looking at. Maybe Lyle had bought a new pair and forgotten to mention it. But that didn't add up. The size was different too, slightly wider, like they belonged to someone else entirely. I called out Lyle's name, my voice echoing through the small space. Nothing. Just the creak of the trailer settling and the faint rustle of wind against the metal siding. The back bedroom door was shut, which was unusual. Lyle always left it open to keep air moving through the place. I pushed it open slowly, not sure what I expected to find, and immediately noticed the bed. Lyle always made it tight, military corners and all that, a habit he'd picked up during his time in the service. But now there was a large dark blotch right in the center of the sheet, damp to the touch but not dripping, like someone had laid something wet down and then pulled it away without cleaning up. There were no footprints on the floor. The dust was undisturbed, perfectly even, like nobody had walked through there in weeks. But right above the window frame I noticed a narrow streak of something oily smeared into the wood. Just one line, thin as a finger, catching the light in a way that made my skin crawl. It looked deliberate, like someone had dragged their fingertip across the frame on purpose, leaving a mark. I didn't stay long after that. Maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. I locked the door behind me, tested it twice to make sure it was secure, and started down the steps. That's when I spotted the missing chair. It was lying on its side in the trees about 30 feet down slope, half hidden by underbrush. At first, I thought maybe the wind had taken it, but then I noticed the tree next to it. 3 deep gouges ran vertically down the bark, all parallel, too straight and deliberate to be animal scratches. The wood underneath was bright and raw, freshly exposed, like whatever had made those marks had done it recently. I backed up slow, my heart beating hard in my throat, and got in the truck as fast as I could. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back. A mile down the road, something crossed in front of my headlights. It was fast, barely a glimpse, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, even hunched over. The skin looked grayish. No fur, no clothing, and its feet bent forward at the middle, almost like hooves but longer, more flexible, like joints bending the wrong way. I gripped the wheel tight and didn't slow down until I saw pavement again. That night I called Lyle. No answer. I tried again the next day. He finally picked up, groggy and confused. He swore he hadn't been up there since the flood. I asked him about the boots. He said he only had 1 pair. I asked about the bed. He said the roof was sealed, no leaks. He sounded genuinely confused, but not surprised. Like he'd expected something like this to happen eventually. 2 months later, I went back. I wasn't going alone this time. My buddy Everett came with me. He's one of those guys who doesn't talk much but notices everything, the kind of person you want with you when things feel off. He brought his lever-action rifle too, not for show. Everett had hunted all over the county and wasn't the type to scare easy. We arrived just after dawn, the air thick and still, not cold but heavy in a way that made it hard to breathe. The trailer looked the same from the outside, but the dirt near the porch was torn up. Not dug, clawed, like something had circled the trailer over and over, scraping the ground with each pass. There were no paw prints, no tracks you could identify, just long, deliberate gouges in the soil that formed an uneven ring around the structure. Everett didn't say a word. He just scanned the tree line with that calm intensity he had, then motioned for me to follow. We walked around the side and checked the windows. The one in the bedroom had a single fogged-over patch on it, like a breath had been pressed there and hadn't dried. Just a perfect oval of condensation on otherwise clean glass. Everett leaned in close, stared for a few seconds, then stepped back without saying anything. That's when he pointed. About 30 yards into the trees, sitting on top of a rotting stump, someone had stacked 5 flat stones in a perfect balance. Under the top one, there was a thick, dark smear, greasy-looking, not red or brown, but something darker and slicker, like used motor oil. We didn't say anything. We just looked at each other, then back at the woods. We carried the missing chair back up to the porch and set it down carefully. The second it touched the boards, we heard it. Something big was moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, breaking thick branches like twigs. The sound circled us once, then stopped. Everett raised the rifle but didn't aim it, just held it across his chest. We stood there, still as stone, listening. Nothing moved for a full 5 minutes. Then, without a word, we left. We didn't speak until we were halfway back to town, and even then, neither of us wanted to talk about what we'd heard. My uncle left me an old cabin after he moved down to Winston-Salem to be closer to family. The place sat just outside a town called Maple Hollow, right up against the edge of Jefferson National Forest, surrounded by trees so thick you couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. After quitting my job in Charleston, burned out and exhausted from years of pretending I had my life together, the cabin felt like exactly what I needed. Something still, something quiet, somewhere I could disappear for a while and figure out what came next. The first few weeks out there were peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I spent my mornings doing repairs, replacing rotted boards on the porch, patching holes in the roof, clearing brush away from the foundation. Afternoons I'd hike the land, following old deer trails that wound through the forest, and evenings I'd sit at the little kitchen table with a notebook, writing down everything I'd done that day. It wasn't like keeping a journal. It was more practical than that, more like a logbook. I'd write down who I'd helped that day, what tools I'd used, which parts of the property still needed work, things I noticed about the forest. It kept me organized and gave me something to focus on besides the noise in my head. Then something changed. One morning, I was flipping back through the notebook to look up a name. Some guy I'd helped fix a porch beam for a few weeks earlier. I found the page I was looking for, but halfway down, there was a line I didn't remember writing. Black ink, my handwriting, my pen. It looked like mine in every way. Same crooked loops, same way I crossed my sevens with a slash through the middle. But I didn't write it. It said, "Don't go near the gulch, past the third ridge." I just sat there staring at it, this weird mix of confusion and unease settling in my chest. I hadn't been drinking. I hadn't smoked anything. I wasn't sleepwalking or losing time. I checked the front page of the notebook where I always write my name and the date when I start a new one. Sure enough, there it was, my signature in my handwriting. But the date said I'd started the notebook a full week before I'd even moved into the cabin. I tried to reason it out. Maybe I'd reused an old notebook without realizing it. But no, all the entries were recent, all about this place, nothing out of order. Every page was filled with notes about repairs, observations about the weather, reminders to pick up supplies in town. There was nothing from before I'd arrived, and yet, somehow, I'd written that warning to myself a week before I'd even known this place existed. Later that afternoon, I decided to hike out to the third ridge just to see if there really was a gulch. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I'd probably written the line half asleep and forgotten about it. But part of me needed to know. The hike took about 40 minutes, longer than I expected, and by the time I reached the third ridge, the sun was starting to dip below the tree line. There was a gulch. It was narrow and sunken, with steep, soft walls and thick clusters of hemlocks pressing in on either side. The light didn't move right through that part of the forest. It kind of pooled in certain spots, like the trees were trapping it, holding it hostage. I didn't go down into the gulch. I just stood near the edge for a minute or two, staring into the shadows below. It was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It felt like a waiting room, like something was holding its breath. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing against me from the inside. I turned back after a bit and walked home, slow, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, even though I couldn't say why. That night, the coyotes sounded closer than usual. Not just louder, closer. I woke up a couple of times thinking I heard something brush across the porch. Not footsteps, something softer, like claws dragging gently across wood. In the morning, nothing seemed out of place until I saw the notebook sitting open on the table. I knew I'd closed it the night before. I always did. But there it was, open to a blank page with another line written in my handwriting. Same pen, same loops. Just one sentence. You heard it last night. That was it for me. I burned the notebook that afternoon. I didn't want to touch it again, didn't want to see what else might appear in those pages. I watched it curl and blacken in the fire pit out back, the pages turning to ash and floating away on the breeze. Then I went into town and bought a fresh notebook, kept it locked in a small box I bolted under the floorboards just in case. Things calmed down after that, at least for a bit. I convinced myself I'd been stressed, that grief does strange things to your brain, that maybe I really had written those lines and just didn't remember. But then came the footprints. I'd laid sand around the cabin foundation to keep snakes out, a trick my uncle had taught me years ago. I made a habit of checking it every morning, smoothing it out with a rake, looking for any signs of animals trying to get underneath. One morning, there were prints, big ones. They looked human at first glance, but not quite. The toes were too long, too wide, and the heel was too narrow, like something that walked upright, but wasn't built the same way we are. The prints started at the edge of the tree line and led straight to the cabin, right up to the side window. Then they went back the way they came, each step spaced about 2 feet apart. Whatever made them wasn't crawling or shuffling. It was walking with purpose. I stared at them for a long time, even got down on my hands and knees to measure them. Each footprint was at least 14 inches long. I borrowed a trail cam from a guy named Benny who ran the bait shop near the gas station. I set it up by the window facing where the prints had ended and let it run for 3 nights. I didn't sleep well during that time. Every sound made me jump. Every creak of the cabin settling made my heart race. On the 4th morning, I went outside to check the camera. It was still there, untampered with, exactly where I'd left it. But when I opened it, the SD card was gone. Just missing. Someone or something had opened the latch, taken the card out, and closed it right back up without leaving a single mark. That's when the noises started. Clicking mostly, not loud, just small precise clicks like the sound a radiator makes when it's cooling down. Except I didn't have a radiator. No furnace either. The sound would move sometimes in the walls, sometimes under the floorboards, always just far enough away that I couldn't pin it down. One night, I woke up to find the front door wide open. The deadbolt was still locked, but the wood around it was cracked, splintered, like something had forced the door open and then gently eased it shut again. It was subtle. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking closely. But I saw it. That same morning, I felt something sore on my back. I checked in the mirror and found 3 small welts near my shoulder blade, evenly spaced, shaped almost like little blunted teeth marks. I didn't remember bumping into anything. I hadn't changed my shirt. They were just there. I didn't think. I just threw on a jacket and headed straight back to that gulch. It was early September, but it felt like late November out there. The temperature dropped the second I crossed the 3rd ridge. I had a headlamp, but the light didn't seem to reach far. Everything felt dim and off balance, like I was walking through a faded photograph. The gulch looked different this time, wider, deeper. The trees around it were bare, even though the rest of the forest was still green. Fog clung low over the bottom. As soon as I stepped into it, my ears started ringing. Not painful, just a flat, high tone like the sound a TV makes when it's on mute. It didn't go away. It just lingered, pressing against the inside of my skull. Then I saw it. Something moved across the far slope. At first I thought it was a person, but no. It was too tall, too thin. Its limbs looked stretched, like someone had pulled them out of proportion. It didn't walk like anything I'd ever seen. No bounce, no weight to its steps. Just gliding, smooth and unnatural. It didn't come toward me. It just turned slowly, tilted what might have been a head in my direction, and stood there. That's when the ringing stopped. Just like that. The silence that followed was worse. I ran. I didn't even think. I just turned and ran through the brush, branches scraping my arms, roots trying to trip me. I nearly twisted my ankle crossing a gully. I made it back to the cabin in one piece, breathing hard, chest burning. The door was shut. Locked from the inside. My boots, which I'd left muddy on the porch, were clean, lined up neatly just inside the door like someone had wiped them off and set them down carefully. I didn't go back inside. I slept in the truck that night, engine idling, headlights pointed at the cabin, watching it until my eyes couldn't stay open anymore. At sunrise, I drove straight to my cousin Drew's place in Wyatt County, didn't even call first. I stayed with him and his wife for almost a month. I never went back to the cabin. I sold the land cheap to a logging company and told them to do whatever they wanted with it. If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. It really does make a difference. I was 29 when it happened. I'd picked up a temp gig through a friend who knew a guy running a trail maintenance outfit just outside Elkmont, Tennessee. The company mostly did signage and erosion control. Boring work, but steady, and they paid well enough that I didn't ask too many questions. This time, they'd been subcontracted by some conservation non-profit to run fencing along parts of Grey Ridge, a remote stretch of forest that barely saw any foot traffic. Normally, we worked in pairs. That morning, my partner Corey bailed last minute. He called me around 6, sounding genuinely miserable. Said he'd eaten some bad chicken and had been throwing up all night. I told him not to worry about it, that I'd handle it on my own. It wasn't the first time I'd gone solo, and the job seemed straightforward enough. I packed the usual gear, a small hand auger, a dozen stakes, wire, gloves, a field map, and my water bottle clipped to the strap like always. I tossed it all into my old canvas frame pack, the one that creaked every time I moved, and headed out. The access trail was overgrown, thick patches of low brush and thorny plants that caught my jeans every few steps. No cell signal, but I'd expected that. My radio was useless by the second ridge, just static, which was normal for these remote areas. I wasn't worried. I'd done this kind of work dozens of times before. It was probably around 8:30 when I hit the flag boundary, marked by faded orange ribbons tied to tree branches. There was no sign of recent use. The forest had that close-in feel, dense tree cover, patchy light, and no movement anywhere. What struck me first was the quiet. I mean, really quiet. No birds, no bug buzz, no wind threading through the branches. It was the kind of quiet that presses on your ears, like when you duck underwater and everything goes muffled. Still, I figured it was just one of those spots. Some valleys and ridgelines trap sound weirdly. I'd worked in quieter places before. I started drilling post holes and setting stakes, boring repetitive work that let my mind wander. I got into the rhythm of it. Dig, drop, tamp, wrap. The usual routine. Then I stepped off the path to pee, maybe 10 or 15 feet into the brush. Nothing fancy. I just didn't want to be right next to the trail. When I came back, I stopped short. The auger wasn't where I'd left it. I'd dropped it next to my pack, leaning it against a tree. Now it was lying 3 feet downhill, halfway turned like someone had started to drag it by the handle. The slope wasn't steep, and the ground was solid. No wet patches, nothing that would have caused it to slide. I stood there staring at it, trying to come up with some reason that made sense. Maybe I'd dropped it carelessly. Maybe it had rolled somehow. But it was too heavy for that. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I picked it up, shook off a few leaves, and got back to work. That should have been my cue to leave. I placed a few more stakes, moving up the ridge, when I noticed I was missing a roll of tension wire. I could have sworn I'd put it back in the pack after using it, but it wasn't there. I figured maybe I'd set it down and forgotten. I took a few steps downhill, scanning the ground, and there it was, about 30 feet away, lying in the brush. Half unspooled in this weird, perfect arc, like someone had flicked their wrist and let it sail through the air. The pattern of the wire didn't look like it had rolled or tumbled. It was too clean, too deliberate, just a wide semicircle lying there untouched, not snagged on anything. That got to me a little. I tried to convince myself I must have dropped it and didn't notice, or maybe the brush had caught it when I pulled something else out of my pack. But that didn't explain the distance or how neat it looked. I stayed still for a while, just listening. Nothing. Not even leaves rustling. Just that same pressure in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I collected the wire, packed up again, and kept moving. I didn't want to leave the job half finished, but I decided I'd go faster, just get it done and get out. I got maybe 100 yards farther before things really started to fall apart. I just set another post, stepped away to clear some deadfall off the trail, and was gone less than a minute. When I turned around, the last 2 stakes I'd planted were gone, not knocked over, not pulled out and tossed aside. Gone. The holes were still there, clean and untouched, but the wood stakes had vanished. I stopped. My hands were already shaking before I even realized it. I turned around slowly, trying to catch a sound, a glimpse of movement, anything, but the forest was still. Too still. I could feel it now, like a pressure behind my ribs in the back of my throat. I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't see anything, but I knew something was watching. It's not a feeling I can explain well. It was like the trees were holding back something that had already seen me, already made a decision about me. I packed everything again, faster this time. No neat wrapping, no checking straps. I just shoved everything into the bag and started moving back the way I'd come. Except the trail wasn't right. The bend near the slope should have led to a straightaway with a small drainage dip. Instead, I found myself back at the same flag boundary where I'd started. I stopped, confused, and turned around to retrace my steps more carefully. I counted paces, watched for my own footprints in the soft dirt. Same bend. Same trees. The lean of the land felt off-kilter, like the slope was slowly twisting beneath me, like the forest had shifted just enough to spin me around without ever moving my feet. And then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Not a boot print. It looked sort of human, wide at the front with 5 uneven toes, but the heels stretched too long, like something that walked upright, but didn't need to, something built differently. The leaf litter around it was undisturbed. No slide marks, no partner print from a walking motion, just one, pressed deep into the dirt. I stood right next to it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was another print a few feet away, facing the opposite direction. Something had stood right where I was standing. It had moved, paused, turned, and then disappeared. But the forest floor was pristine around it. No path, no marks, like it had vanished straight into the air. My chest tightened. I turned and walked fast. Downhill, whatever downhill meant at that point. The slope beneath me felt like it was changing, shifting with every step. Every few yards I had to correct my balance, like the ground was tilting without warning. After a while, I stopped to catch my breath and instinctively reached for my water bottle. It was gone. I always clip it through the same strap on my pack. I'd checked it maybe 15 minutes ago. I spun around, checked the ground, the brush. Nothing. Then I saw another footprint. This one was half hidden under a mountain laurel branch, pressed into the soft dirt I'd just walked across. Fresh. Sharp. And I hadn't heard a sound. That did it. I ran. Branches caught my arms, scratched my face. I dropped the auger and didn't even remember letting go of it. I sprinted downhill, hoping I was still aimed toward the access road, but the woods didn't make sense anymore. Trees repeated. I passed a stump I swore I'd already passed 15 minutes earlier. The undergrowth looked copied and pasted, identical in every direction. My chest was on fire, my legs aching, and then I saw it. Up the ridge, not downhill, up. Maybe 15 feet away. It wasn't tall, probably a little shorter than me, but everything about it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, bent at angles that didn't make anatomical sense. The skin looked like dried bark that had half-rotted, pale gray and cracked. It didn't move. It just stood there, half-crouched, head turned my way, and its eyes flat, deep-set, like holes cut into a mask. No shine, just black. We locked eyes for one breath. That's all I could handle. I ran. Didn't look back. Didn't slow down. Eventually, the trees opened up and I hit gravel. I nearly fell face first, but caught myself and stumbled to the contractor truck. I threw up everything I had, checked the clock on the dashboard. It was just past noon. I'd been out there for less than 4 hours, but it had felt like days. I got in the truck and drove straight back to the depot. My boss, Dan, asked if I was okay. I said I felt sick. He didn't press. After that, I never went back to that site. I told them I couldn't do remote jobs anymore, that I needed to stay closer to town. They didn't argue. I think they could tell something had happened, even if I didn't say what. There was this old cabin my uncle owned way up in the hills of Renshaw County, deep in the kind of back country where people still burned their trash and fixed their own vehicles because calling someone would take too long. He hadn't touched the place in years, not since his health started going downhill and he couldn't make the drive anymore. I remembered it from a couple of summer trips when I was a kid, back when everything felt like an adventure. No electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove and 4 walls that didn't leak. It was rough, but it was honest. After a bad breakup and too many nights scrolling through text messages I should have deleted, I decided I needed to disappear for a while. Just get away from everything, clear my head, figure out what came next. So I took a week off work, packed up a cooler with enough food to last, filled a backpack with the basics, sleeping bag, flashlight, axe, first aid kit, and drove the 2.5 hours out to Renshaw County. The road turned to gravel about 20 miles in, and I had to park near an old logging marker where the trail started to climb. The rest was on foot. I remembered the hike being shorter, but maybe my memory had sanded off the rough edges. Either way, it took almost an hour, and by the time I made it up to the cabin, I was drenched in sweat and convinced I'd forgotten how to breathe properly. but the cabin was still there. It sagged a little, sure, and the front step was loose, but it was standing. Windows intact, roof solid. Inside, everything was where I'd left it in my memory. An old iron stove, 2 mismatched chairs, a warped wooden table, and the tiny ladder leading to the loft. Thick dust coated every surface, but there were no signs of animals or rot. I spent the afternoon sweeping and airing the place out, opening windows, shaking out old blankets. I lit a fire in the stove to push out the damp, cooked some sausage and potatoes in a cast-iron skillet, and cracked open a paperback I'd grabbed on the way out of town. That night, I went to bed early, totally exhausted but kind of proud of myself. It felt good to be away from everything, to not have my phone buzzing every 5 minutes, to just exist in the quiet. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a scratching noise overhead. At first, I thought it was wind brushing branches across the roof, but the more I listened, the less it sounded like that. There was a rhythm to it, deliberate, like someone dragging their foot across the metal, stopping, then dragging again. I sat up, heart doing that slow thump, thump thing it does when you're not fully awake, but your body's on alert. I listened for a while. Nothing else. Eventually, I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin, looked up at the roof, poked around the ground for fallen branches, anything that might explain the sound, but everything was undisturbed. No prints, no debris. I shrugged it off and went about my day. Chopped more wood, ate, read, stared at trees. That night I stayed up later. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. I had the lantern going, book open, feet kicked up near the stove when I heard it again. Not on the roof this time. Outside, just past the front wall. Soft steps. Shuffle. Pause. Shuffle. Like someone walking with a limp. Then it stopped. I turned off the lantern so fast I nearly knocked it over, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow from the stove. The fire gave off just enough light to outline the window next to the door. I watched it, barely breathing. After a minute, maybe less, maybe more, I have no idea, something passed in front of the window. Just a shadow, tall, broad, there for one heartbeat, then gone. I didn't move, didn't go outside. Just sat there with my hand on the axe and my back pressed against the wall until it got light again. When I finally stepped outside the next morning, everything looked normal. Birds were chirping, wind in the trees. That kind of cruel normal that makes you question if you imagined the whole thing. But that window was 6 feet off the ground. Whatever stood there had to be taller than that. A deer couldn't do that. A bear wouldn't move like that. And nothing should have been that quiet. Still, I tried to shake it off. I went down to the stream, washed up, even laughed a little at myself for letting the woods get to me. People pay good money for this kind of silence, right? I stayed out longer that day, didn't come back until just before sunset. That night I locked the door, then shoved the table in front of it. Not like it would have stopped anything serious, but it made me feel a little better. Sometime around 2 in the morning I heard tapping. Not footsteps, not shuffling, tapping. 3 soft, deliberate knocks on the wall behind my bed. That part of the cabin backs up to the loft window. A small square thing tucked into the roof facing the treetops. I hadn't opened it, hadn't even cleaned it. I climbed out of bed, every step feeling like it took an hour, and went up the ladder. I pressed my face to the glass. There was nothing there, just fog and branches. I stayed in the loft the rest of the night, axe in hand, not even trying to sleep. The next morning, I decided I was done. Didn't care if it made me look weak. I packed everything up fast, tied my boots tight, and stepped outside. 20 yards from the cabin, I froze. The trail was wrong. I stood there for a long time trying to figure it out. The trees looked the same, the air smelled the same, but the ground didn't dip where it should have, and the big rock that usually marked the turn was gone. I turned around to double-check my bearings. The cabin wasn't there. I swear I turned a full circle, looked exactly where it should have been, and there was nothing. Just woods. Panic hit me like a wave. I ran back the way I'd come, straight line, not stopping, nothing, no clearing, no building, just trees. And the worst part? No sound, no birds, no insects, just this heavy, dead silence pressing in from every side. I waited, told myself the sun would move, give me direction. It didn't. I sat for hours, I think. The sun just hung there, low over the treetops, frozen like someone had hit pause on the world. Eventually, I started walking, not toward anything, just away. I don't know how long I walked, hours, days. It felt like neither. I didn't get hungry. I didn't get tired. I didn't feel anything. At some point, I saw the cabin again, but it was different. The chimney was gone. The door frame was empty. The window was still there, but through it, the inside looked hollow. No stove, no furniture. Just a dirt floor and one tree stump right in the middle, charred black like it had been burned and forgotten. I didn't go inside. I backed away slow, eyes on the window until the trees hid it again. Then I ran. Next thing I remember, I was lying in a ditch beside a dirt road, barely conscious. A farmer driving past saw my pack and pulled over. He said I looked like I'd been out there for days. When I checked my watch, it said I'd only been gone one night. 2 weeks later, I went back with my uncle. I needed to see if any of it had been real. The cabin was there. Same saggy porch, same table, same stove, same loft. Everything just like I'd left it, except for one thing. Up in the loft, carved into the underside of the window frame, neatly, deeply, like it had been etched with purpose, was a single word. Return. I left Renshaw County for good after that. Moved 3 states over. Changed my number. Never told anyone the full story until now. At the time, I was staying with my cousin Boone out near the Kentucky-Tennessee border, in one of those forgotten pockets of Appalachia where the roads don't have names and the mailboxes are just numbers nailed to trees. Boone had inherited an old cabin from his dad, more like a run-down shack with a porch and some barely working plumbing, but it had good bones. I'd come down for a couple of weeks to help him clear out an old barn that was collapsing behind the property. The structure had been standing since the 50s, and time hadn't been kind to it. We'd spend most of the day hauling out rotted wood, broken tools, rusted scrap that hadn't been touched in decades. By sundown, we were usually too beat to move much, so we'd sit on the porch, passing a 6-pack back and forth and talking about whatever came to mind. Mostly dumb stuff. Stories from high school, bad dates. Boone's ex-girlfriend, who apparently thought the moon landing was faked because the shadows looked too professional. Normal cousin talk. But even in those easy moments, Boone had this habit of glancing toward the tree line. Not in an obvious way, not like he was on edge, but it was there. Like something in the woods kept stealing his attention. He'd stop mid-sentence sometimes and tilt his head slightly, like he'd caught a whisper just out of range. Then he'd go right back to talking, never mentioning it. I noticed it the first day, but didn't say anything. Figured maybe he was used to hearing critters moving around out there. Bears, coyotes, whatever Kentucky has that breathes heavy and crunches leaves. It wasn't until the 3rd night that he actually said something. We were sitting outside, no lights on, just the soft buzz of bugs and the faint orange tip of Boone's cigarette floating in the dark. The trees were nothing but black shapes out there, swaying just enough to look like they were breathing. Out of nowhere, he said, "If you hear it, don't answer." I thought I'd misheard him. I asked, "Hear what?" He didn't look at me, just took another drag and let the smoke out slow. It's not a thing you talk to." That was all he said. No smile, no joke. He didn't even act like it was weird. Just said it like he might tell someone not to leave food on the porch unless they wanted raccoons. I didn't push it. Boone's got a dry way about him, and sometimes he'll say something bizarre just to see how you react. But this didn't feel like that. There wasn't any of that usual smugness in his voice. Just something cold and flat, like he was giving me a rule. The next morning, Boone drove into town to pick up supplies. Tools, gas, maybe more beer. I stayed behind to sort through the last pile of rotting boards by the barn. I worked through most of the morning, then figured I'd walk the property line. I'd only seen bits of it and wanted to get a sense of where the land ended. Boone had mentioned once not to bother with the northern ridge. Said it was overgrown and a pain to get through. "Nothing worth seeing up there," he'd said. But there weren't any fences or markers, and I didn't have anything else to do. So of course I went north. It started normal, just dense woods and underbrush. Typical hiking terrain, a few old beer cans near a tree stump, probably from high school bonfires years ago. The further I went, though, the thicker it got. Not just the brush. The air. It felt heavier, like the atmosphere had changed. The way it sometimes feels right before a thunderstorm, when the sky hasn't decided if it wants to crack open yet. But the sky was clear. The light changed too. It filtered through the leaves in this uneven, choppy way, like the canopy was stitched together wrong. 1 second bright, the next second dim, like dusk. It made everything feel deeper than it was, like I'd walked further than I actually had. Then I heard the cough. Not an animal sound. Too human. Dry like sandpaper scraping the back of a throat. Just one from somewhere beyond a dense patch of pine trees. I froze and listened. It came again, rougher this time. It sounded like someone was sick and trying not to make noise, like they were hiding. My first thought was Boone. Maybe he'd doubled back through another trail and was messing with me. I called out casually, "Hey, that you?" "Nothing. Just that weird quiet you get when the woods go dead still, like every living thing has stopped moving at once." I stood there for a few more seconds, then decided to head back. Not because I was scared exactly. Just uneasy. Like something was off in the geometry of the place, and I didn't want to find out why. Then I heard my name. Not yelled. Just spoken. Calm. Familiar. It was Boone's voice, without question. Same tone, same inflection, but it didn't feel right. It hit my ears wrong, like a recording that had been cleaned up too much. No background noise, no breath, too smooth. I didn't move. It said my name again. Exactly the same. Same rhythm. Same pause between syllables, like pressing replay on a voice memo. But there were no footsteps, no rustling, no sign of anyone nearby. Just my name, floating out from behind the trees like it had been waiting to be used. I backed away slowly. I didn't speak, didn't turn my head, just started walking, smooth and steady, hands slightly out in case I tripped. Every part of me wanted to bolt, but something in the back of my skull told me not to. Not yet. Don't give it a reason. After a few minutes, felt like hours, I noticed the light had changed again. It was brighter, warmer, and then I saw the clearing, the roof of the cabin peeking through the trees like a lifeline. When Boone got back, I told him what happened. I kept it basic. Said I thought maybe someone was out there screwing with us, trying to sound like him. Boone didn't ask questions. He just nodded, walked inside, opened a drawer, and pulled out an old bolt-action rifle. He didn't even check it for ammo. Just handed it to me. "Keep it with you," he said. "Don't need to shoot it. Just hold it." That was it. He didn't go into the woods after that. Neither did I. We stuck to the porch or stayed indoors. Boone didn't seem scared. Just resigned, like he'd accepted something he didn't want to explain. Then came our last night. It was warm, so we left the windows open, lights off. I was dozing on the couch. Boone was in his room. The place was dead quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood settling. Then I heard the footsteps. Not fast. Not loud. Just slow, deliberate crunches on dry leaves, moving along the edge of the clearing. I didn't sit up. I didn't breathe. Then it said Boone's name. Once. But it didn't sound like Boone. Not even close this time. The voice was lower, like someone dragging gravel across a tin sheet. The syllables didn't land right. Too long, like it was trying to imitate speech without understanding how timing worked. I glanced through the doorway and saw Boone sitting upright on his bed. He wasn't moving, just staring at the window across from him. I don't think he blinked. The thing outside circled the cabin once, maybe twice. We didn't check. We didn't speak. By morning there were tracks, not boots, not paws, something in between, long, narrow impressions like toes, spaced apart like a man's stride, but deeper than any barefoot print should have been, too clean for mud, too sharp for dirt. Boone didn't comment. He just poured salt along the windowsills and burned something in an old coffee can on the front steps. It smelled like pine and dried herbs, bitter and sharp. He said it might confuse it, make it forget for a while. I packed that afternoon and left before sundown. I was 22 when all that weirdness happened. My cousin Leah had landed this maintenance gig fixing up old cabins out near Red Vale, a cluster of church-owned properties that had been sitting empty for years. The church wanted to turn them into a retreat center or something, rent them out to groups looking for a quiet place to pray or reflect or whatever people do when they want to get away from the world. Leah needed help, offered me cash under the table, and I said yes, mostly out of boredom. I was between jobs, living in my parents' basement and spending way too much time online. Getting out into the woods for a few weeks sounded like exactly what I needed. For a while, it was exactly that. We worked our way through the property slowly, clearing out buildings one by one. Most of them were in rough shape, holes in the roofs. Birds nesting in cabinets, porches that sagged so bad you felt them give when you stepped too hard. Still, there was something nice about being out there. No traffic, no deadlines, just the sound of tools and trees. By early July, we'd made it to the last 3 cabins. These were tucked in tighter, clustered at the bottom of a low ridge, a bit more secluded than the others. The first 2 were familiar territory, just more decay and pest problems. We joked that one smelled like a possum had died in the rafters, and the other had a squirrel so bold it watched us from the loft, like a landlord inspecting tenants. Normal weirdness. Then we got to the 3rd one. This cabin sat just a little off from the others, behind a curve in the trees. Not far, maybe 50 yards, but you wouldn't spot it unless you knew where to look. Leah pointed out something odd right away. Her map, this hand-sketched layout from the church archives, only showed 2 buildings in that section, not 3. She checked it again, flipping the page over like the 3rd cabin might be hiding somewhere in the margins. But nope. 2 structures. And yet, here was a 3rd, plain as day. It didn't look newer or different. The boards were just as gray and weathered. The roof slouched like the others. Ivy had crept up one side. Still, I remember how quiet it felt as we walked up. Not just regular forest quiet, the kind that makes you want to hold your breath without knowing why. Inside, it was empty. Not trashed, not abandoned in the way the others had been. Empty, like no one had ever used it. Just 4 walls, a floor and dust. No chairs, no hooks on the walls. Not even a nail where someone might have hung a mirror. No signs of mice or bugs. It was like someone had built a cabin and then forgotten to give it a purpose. I asked Leah if it could have been rebuilt, but she crouched down and scraped the baseboard with her thumbnail. Same old wood, same stone foundation as the others. Still, we both felt weird about it. Not scared exactly. Just thrown off. We left early that day. Told ourselves we'd hit it fresh the next morning, like somehow doing it first thing would make it easier. So the next day, we headed in with more gear, paint, extra tarps, a new circular saw. Leah brought this battered radio that barely picked up a station, but it was better than silence. We kept it playing fuzz and faint country music while we worked. It helped take the edge off. Sometime around noon, Leah went back to the truck to grab more supplies. I stayed behind to keep working on one of the windows. I was sanding the edge of the sill when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow and clear, like someone stepping across the floor carefully, trying not to startle me. I turned, half expecting Leah. The doorway was empty. I waited. Nothing. Took a breath. Stepped outside. The woods were still. No birds, no bugs, no wind. Dead quiet in a way that made my skin crawl. I called out. No answer. A few minutes later, Leah came back, lugging tarps over her shoulder. I asked if she'd forgotten something and doubled back to mess with me. She shook her head. I believed her. That night, we stayed in a tiny rental about 10 minutes down the road. One of those roadside cabins that looks charming until you see the wallpaper peeling behind the dresser. I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, I got up to use the bathroom. The little window over the sink looked out toward the woods. While I was washing my hands, I saw movement in the dark. Something was crawling across the tree line. Not fast, not clumsy either. It moved like it had a purpose, pulling itself forward with long, deliberate motions. Too big to be a person, too long to be a dog. The way it moved, elbows or knees or whatever it had, reminded me of a lizard, but bigger and wrong. I ducked out of sight, heart pounding, waited a minute, then another. When I looked again, it was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At breakfast, Leah looked rough too. I didn't even have to ask. She just said she'd kept dreaming about that third cabin, walking in circles inside it, hearing something scratching below the floorboards. Not a nightmare, she said. Just something looping, like my brain couldn't shake the image. We didn't talk much on the way back. The woods felt normal again. Birds were out, bugs buzzing. It was almost a relief. But I still watched the tree line more than usual. Leah started working on the steps while I went inside. I figured I'd pry up some warped boards in the corner before we started painting. Just standard repair work. I wedged a crowbar in and popped one loose. Something underneath shifted. Not a bug. Not a root. Something bigger. I froze. Let go of the crowbar. Took one step back. Leah must have heard the noise. She came in, asking if I'd found a raccoon or something. I just pointed. Under that board was a hole. A perfect hole, dug straight into the earth, about 3 feet wide. Just big enough for a person to squeeze through. The dirt looked fresh. Not caved in, not packed down. Fresh. The edges of the wood above it were torn up, deep gouges, like someone or something had tried to claw its way through. Not scratches. Gouges. Leah lowered her phone into the hole with the flashlight on. The light hit something pale, like a hand, or the curve of a shoulder. It moved out of the beam before we could tell what it was. We nailed the board back down. Sloppy. Didn't speak for a while. The hike out felt worse than usual. It felt like we weren't getting anywhere, like the trail was looping. Trees started looking familiar in a déjà vu kind of way. Leah stopped suddenly and said we'd passed the same dead tree twice. It had this crooked branch that split into a perfect Y shape. She tore off a strip of duct tape and slapped it onto the trunk so we'd know for sure. 10 minutes later, we passed it again. The same tree, the same tape. We ditched the trail, cut straight downhill through brush and thorns until we hit the old church fence. We didn't talk, didn't stop. We left every single tool behind. That night, just after 2, I got a voicemail from Leah. Her voice was low, shaky. She said someone had knocked on her bedroom window. Then she said, "I live on the 2nd floor." That was it. She moved out the next morning. Didn't tell anyone where she was going, just disappeared. I stayed in Red Vale another week, barely slept. Every little sound had me jumping. Then I left too, and that was enough. I was 29 when this happened, working freelance gigs around the east end of Redvine, a small town tucked into the mountains where everybody knew everybody and strangers stood out like blood on snow. I mostly worked for a surveyor named Clay, a decent guy in his 50s who paid on time and didn't ask too many questions about my past. We marked private lots for buyers, traced out old property lines, flagged land for developers, whatever people needed to keep their deeds straight. I'd been doing it for a few years by then, long enough to know the local terrain like the back of my hand. This particular job came through in late October, just after the leaves had started falling hard, and the air had turned cold enough to see your breath in the mornings. We got a request from a retired couple, Darrell and Joanna Cartwright, who'd inherited a chunk of land up past Holston Ridge. They were planning to build a seasonal cabin and needed the property lines marked before they could move forward with permits. Normally, I'd head out with Vince, my usual partner. We worked smooth together. He'd handle the GPS and notes. I'd cut brush and flag the trees. Easy. But the morning of the job, Vince called saying his daughter had taken a bad fall off a swing set and fractured her wrist. He was headed to the hospital and wouldn't be able to make it. There was no backup available, and Clay needed the job started that week, so I said I'd go alone. It wasn't the first solo hike I'd done. I'd handled back lots and wooded corners alone before. You just prep carefully. Extra water, good boots, printed plats, and a physical compass, since phones go dead or useless once you're more than a mile into the holler. I drove out there early that morning. The access road was little more than a gravel shoulder with a rusted gate chained shut. I parked by the pull-off, signed the land access papers the Cartwrights had left under a rock, and started hiking in. The first part was easy. Mostly clear ground, gentle slope. After about an hour, I spotted the first boundary marker, one of those old wooden stakes with faded pink tape around the top, half-rotted and barely upright. Still counted. I marked it in my notes, took a quick GPS check, then started heading northeast toward where the second stake should have been. That's when I heard it. It came from below me on the slope. Sharp, sudden laughter. High-pitched, almost like a kid's, but too clear, too loud. Didn't sound like any child's laugh I'd heard before. It was too strained, like someone trying to imitate a child but pushing it too far, making it unnatural. Then silence. I froze for a second. Scanned the trees. The undergrowth was thick, with a few deer trails winding between fallen branches and old rocks. Could have been another hiker. Could have been someone camping illegally. Maybe even kids screwing around. I called out. Just a simple hello. Nothing. I stood there for another 30 seconds, waiting to hear someone move, respond, even laugh again. No response, no leaves rustling, just the regular creak of trees in the wind and the faint sound of water from a stream downhill. Eventually, I chalked it up to someone passing through and went back to work. I moved on, tied a new ribbon at the second location, and kept following the old property line. I'd gone maybe another mile, carefully checking angles, brushing through ferns and undergrowth when I caught a smell. It hit hard and clung to the air, wet dog fur mixed with spoiled meat. I've stumbled across decomposing deer before, and this wasn't far off from that, but something about it felt older, more sour than rotten. I looked around, expecting to see a carcass, but there was nothing. No bones, no scavenger trail, not even buzzards overhead. Then I spotted the third boundary stake, and just behind it, wrapped around a low pine, was one of the orange ribbons I'd tied earlier, but I hadn't doubled back. I'd been walking a straight northeast line. My notes were clear, my angles matched, there was no loop in my route, and yet here was a ribbon I'd tied 20 minutes earlier. I pulled out my compass. North was still north, but something wasn't right. The slope behind me looked different, felt like I'd walked into a mirror version of the terrain. My notes didn't line up. Landmarks I'd jotted down weren't where they should have been. That's when my hands started feeling clammy. That quiet, slow crawl of dread settling into my chest. I retraced my steps slowly, this time dragging chalk across tree trunks so I'd know for sure. 15 minutes in, I passed the same moss-covered log, same crushed ferns, and next to it, a boot print in the mud. Mine. I checked the angle. I'd never turned around, and yet somehow I'd ended up walking in a circle. I sat down, took off my pack, drank water, tried to slow my breathing, told myself I'd gotten turned around, that it happened more often than people thought. I waited, listening. But the forest was too quiet. No squirrels, no birds, just the faint creaking of trees and the occasional soft breeze. The air felt different, dense, like walking through warm laundry steam. And that smell kept coming back, not constant, but drifting through in little waves. Then I saw something move. Between two narrow poplars, about 40 feet out, something stepped once. Long stride, deliberate. I thought it was a person at first. Tall, barefoot, maybe shirtless. Then I looked again. Its joints bent wrong. The knees bowed backward like a deer's, and the arms hung too long, almost down to the knees. The skin, if it was skin, looked like wet bark or leather. Pale gray or washed-out brown. No hair, no clothes. And where its face should have been was just a smooth blank patch, like the shape of a head pressed into clay and never finished. I stared for maybe 30 seconds. It didn't move again. Then it shifted, just slightly, and I realized it was closer than before, even though I hadn't seen it take a step. I didn't run. I didn't speak. I stood up, packed my water bottle, and started walking again. Not fast, not slow, just steady. About 200 feet up the trail, I heard the laugh again. Same pitch, same unnatural ring to it, but this time it echoed from both ahead of me and behind me, like two voices trying to time the same awful sound. I kept walking. Eventually, I hit a fence line I hadn't seen on the map. Old rusted chicken wire strung between crooked trees. It looked like it had been there for decades, nails rusted deep, some wire sagging into the brush. I followed it to the left, thought maybe it would lead to a clearing or a trailhead. After a while, 20 minutes maybe, I saw a gate. It was rusted half shut, bent inward like something had pushed through hard a long time ago. Just past the gate was a spiral of bones. Dozens of small animal skulls arranged in a perfect ring, all facing outward. Raccoons, maybe possums, clean and white. In the center of the spiral was a pair of boots. Not just any boots. Vince's boots. I recognized them instantly. Same scuffed leather. Same notch on the heel where he'd nicked a chainsaw blade last spring. The right toe still had that tear from when he'd kicked a rock marker. But Vince hadn't been out with me. He wasn't anywhere near Holston Ridge that day. He was at the hospital with his daughter. I didn't step closer. I turned, pulled out my compass again, found the setting sun, and headed west. Didn't care what the map said anymore. If west meant out, I was going that way, even when the trees thickened, even when I started hearing an extra footstep behind every one of mine. Never ahead, never too close. Just always one beat after. I didn't stop. After maybe 45 minutes, the woods thinned and I saw the gravel pull off through the brush. My truck was still there. Everything looked normal. I climbed in and checked the time. I'd been out there over 5 hours. That job was supposed to take 3. That night, Vince called to check in, said he hoped the job had gone okay. I asked him straight up if he'd ever lost gear on a survey run. He said no, never. I told him about the boots. There was a long pause. Then he just said, "I don't want that tracked again." Neither do I. I was 28 when I moved into the trailer out by Ember Hollow, a forgotten stretch of back country where the roads twisted through hills so steep your ears popped just driving through. My last breakup had gone nuclear, shouting matches, restraining orders, the works, and I needed to get as far away from that mess as possible. A friend of mine, Clay, had inherited this place from a cousin who'd apparently died alone out there and left no will. Clay said I could live there as long as I paid the property taxes and didn't complain when the roof leaked. That seemed fair. The first time I drove in, my phone lost signal 3 turns before I hit the driveway, and the gravel nearly tore the bumper off my car. The nearest neighbor was a guy named Eldon, whose house sat a good 1/4 mile uphill with an old water tower behind it and a porch full of broken rocking chairs. He'd nod sometimes when I passed, but never said anything more than, "Morning." Always watching, though. Always, like he was waiting for me to ask a question he hoped I wouldn't, but I didn't mind the quiet. Honestly, that's what I was after. Somewhere nobody knew me, where I could sleep without sirens or arguing through the walls, and for the first couple of weeks it was fine. Cold, sure. Some nights I had to sleep in 2 jackets with socks on my hands, but fine. Then came the knocking. It was almost midnight. I'd fallen asleep on the busted love seat in front of the little space heater with the radio still on, and I remember waking up because everything had gone quiet. No music, no heater hum. Just silence. Then 3 knocks. Not fast, not frantic. Slow, measured, like someone counting beats in their head. They came from the back wall near the kitchen window. I sat up and waited, but it didn't happen again. I thought maybe it was pipes shifting or the old place settling. I took the flashlight and stepped outside, boots crunching on the frost-hardened dirt, and walked the perimeter. Nothing. No animals. No branches fallen. Just the woods behind the trailer, darker than pitch, the trees packed in tight and close like a crowd listening in. I didn't sleep much after that. In the daylight, I noticed the scratches. 3 deep lines, about chest height, gouged into the aluminum siding on the back wall. They weren't clean. More like someone had scraped with something blunt but solid. Not a knife. The cuts looked worn, like whatever made them had done it before. I took a photo and texted Clay, "Hey, your cousin leave me any pets?" He left it on red. A week later, around 2 in the morning, I heard something walking outside. I hadn't gone to bed yet. I was sitting at the little fold-out table playing solitaire when I caught the noise. Dry leaves shifting, gravel crunching softly, like weight moving slow and heavy. I killed the lights and crouched behind the curtain, peeking through the blinds. My old truck was parked out front, and I could see something tall just beyond it. Real tall. Its head was visible over the top of the cab. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear, but the shape was off. The limbs were too long, not in a stretched-out, lanky way, but like the joints didn't belong where they were. Its arms hung low, elbows bent backward, and its head slumped forward like it was too heavy or held on wrong. I didn't see a face. It didn't turn or make a sound. Just moved along the side of the trailer and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. 2 days later, Eldon came down the hill. That alone was weird. He'd never left his porch in the time I'd lived there. He just showed up around noon, holding a paper bag with something dark and greasy inside. "Jerky," he said, handing it over. Then he stood there, looking past me toward the woods like he wasn't really seeing me at all. I asked him what was going on. He didn't answer right away, just chewed the inside of his cheek for a bit, then muttered, "You seen it yet?" His voice was low, almost like he regretted asking. I said I didn't know what he meant. He gave this slow nod, still staring at the tree line. "I don't like the cold," he said, "but it gets hungry when the ground freezes." Then he turned around and walked back up to his house, never looking back. After that, I stopped going outside at night. I kept the blinds drawn and the lights off once the sun dipped behind the hills. I even blocked the gaps under the doors with towels, but it didn't help. I started hearing things just beyond the trees, soft, rasping breaths that didn't match any animal I knew. And this weird clicking sound, like someone flicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth over and over. It wasn't constant, just every few nights, like it was checking to see if I was still there. Then one morning, I decided I'd had enough. I figured I'd go stay with my sister Callie for a while. She lived in Monroe, about 2 hours east, and had a spare room. I packed what I needed into the truck, locked up, and stepped outside around 6 in the morning. That's when I saw the prints. They started at the edge of the woods and circled the trailer, not boot prints, not animal tracks. They looked vaguely human but stretched. Each foot was easily twice the length of mine, with 3 thick toes ending in round, dull impressions like blunt claws. The ground was hard from the cold, but the prints were deep, like whatever made them was heavy. They looped once around the trailer, paused beneath my bedroom window, and ended right beside the driver's door of my truck. I froze. I didn't even try to start the engine. That night I heard tapping on the kitchen window. Just one tap every 30 seconds. Perfect rhythm, no scratching, no pounding. Just that steady, deliberate sound, like a knuckle or a stone. I sat on the floor with a shotgun I barely knew how to use, counting the seconds out loud like I could keep myself anchored. It lasted over an hour. When it finally stopped, I didn't move until sunlight spilled in. The next day, I walked up to Eldon's house. I hadn't seen him out front all morning, which was odd. His porch was empty, and the screen door was flapping open. I called out. No answer. The smell hit me halfway up the steps. Not rot exactly. More like wet fur, pennies, and burned wood. Inside was a mess. Every piece of furniture had been ripped up and thrown aside like kindling. The walls were stripped down to the studs in places, the insulation clawed out in tangled chunks. Everything looked like it had been spun in a circle, torn from the outside in, or maybe the inside out. But the center of the room, right under the ceiling fan, was untouched. One perfect print marked the floorboards there, same as the ones I'd seen by my truck. I drove into town that afternoon, didn't stop to pack, didn't even shut the door behind me. I called Clay from the gas station on the highway and told him I was done. I mailed him the keys a week later. I'd agreed to cover a shift for a buddy who worked maintenance on one of the state's radio towers, way out past Mount Herald in an area so remote it didn't even have a name on most maps. Not my usual job. I was more of a diagnostics guy, usually glued to a campus office in Charleston, staring at screens and troubleshooting signal problems from the comfort of air conditioning. But Tom called me the night before, sounding like death. Said he'd been throwing up for hours, could barely stand. He begged, said it'd just be a half-day job, mostly checking equipment readouts, tightening a few casings, logging uplink interference. "You're in and out by lunch," he promised. I owed him a few favors, so I agreed. The tower was deep in one of those unmarked service zones, technically state property, but surrounded by what looked like unmanaged forest, the kind of place where you lose reception before you even hit the turnoff. I drove an hour and a half through winding back roads, then another 20 minutes down what was supposed to be an access road. Really, it was just a dirt path with a gate that had one of those old padlocks that fights you every step of the way. I parked where the trees started to close in. From there, it was a good 10-minute hike uphill, carrying a gear bag over one shoulder and a handheld scanner clipped to my vest. The site itself was basic. A steel equipment shed, maybe 10 by 10, bolted onto a concrete slab with the transmission tower rising right behind it. Looked like every other Backwoods relay point I'd seen. The first hour went smooth. I got the shed unlocked, powered up the diagnostic system, and let the fans kick in. Inside smelled like dust and old wiring, but everything seemed to come online fine. Readings were a bit higher on the static end than expected, but no active interference flagged. I figured it was a grounding quirk, common in these older builds. I moved around the tower to check hardware mounts. The sun hadn't fully crested the ridge yet, so the whole site was in this muted, shadowy calm. I was crouched, tightening one of the lower sensor brackets when I heard it. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Not fast. Not random. Just one deliberate footstep, then another. I stood still and listened. It came again. Slow. Steady. Definitely bipedal. I turned toward the tree line, expecting to maybe see a hiker or some maintenance guy I hadn't been told about. Nothing. Just trees. I waited a bit, scanned with my eyes, then walked down the slope toward where the sound had come from. No footprints, no broken branches. The underbrush was untouched. I even brushed some of it aside with my boot. Completely undisturbed. I circled the tower once more, slower this time. Still nothing out of place. Back inside the shed, I sat at the terminal and started syncing the log files. That's when the door behind me rattled. Loud. Hard. Not wind, not a draft. It yanked like someone on the other side had grabbed it and let go. I jumped, spun around, and opened it again. No one. Just air. The trees were still, no gust, no rustling. I leaned out, checked both directions. Nothing moved. I stared at the ridge for a long time. No bugs, no bird calls. The silence hit different. I propped the door open after that, not because I expected someone to burst in, but because I didn't want to feel sealed in. The weirdness let up for a bit. I forced myself to keep working. Rechecked the transmission parameters, skimmed the log history. Everything stable, until I stepped outside again to inspect one of the exposed signal cables. I took maybe 10 steps away from the shed when my scanner blinked red and buzzed against my chest. Lost sync. That wasn't supposed to happen. The handheld only drops connection if the transmitter goes offline or someone cuts power. I bolted back inside. The entire diagnostics board was dark. The power breaker, which I had flipped up less than an hour ago, was now down. Not tripped. Switched, like someone had physically flipped it. I stood there staring at it for a second. Then I threw it back on. Fans rebooted. Systems whirred. Lights blinked in sequence. Everything powered back like nothing had happened. I watched the boot screen, then looked up, just habit, and noticed something through the window. There was a figure standing on the far side of the tower. It took my brain a second to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't quite shaped like a person, but it stood upright, too tall for a deer, too narrow for a human. Its edges shimmered a little, like bad compression on a low-res video feed. Not quite stable. I leaned closer, squinting. The figure moved, but not away. It slid sideways, staying in line with the metal supports of the tower. Silent. No crunch of gravel. No shift in leaves. It knew how to stay hidden, or it didn't care whether I could see it. I grabbed the field radio and flipped to the emergency band. The green light blinked. Connection was live. I spoke into it. Nothing but static. Not garbled voice, not wind interference, just deep, empty white noise. I tried again. Still nothing. The radio wasn't broken. It was transmitting, but I wasn't getting anything back. I stepped outside with my flashlight. Told myself I'd just circle the base, maybe see where it went. No sudden moves. I walked slow, sweeping the light across the clearing. There was nothing there. Behind the tower. Empty. I walked all the way around. Still nothing. Not even disturbed dirt. But when I turned back, the shed door was closed again. Latched. That stopped me cold. I'd propped it open with a gear case. No way it shut on its own. I went straight back, faster this time. Opened the shed. The scanner had restarted. There were new error entries. Over a dozen, all recent. Everyone said the same thing. Foreign interference detected, but no frequency, no ID, just blank sources and timestamps clustered within a few minutes of each other. I copied the entire error report onto my USB stick. While the system finalized, I glanced out the window again. Now, in the woods beyond the tree line, I saw more figures. Not close, but there. Just vertical forms. Too tall, too symmetrical, not trees, not poles. They didn't move. They watched. That was my breaking point. I powered down the transmitter manually, skipped the shutdown protocol, shoved whatever tools I could into the gear bag, and got out. It was almost sunset. The light through the trees was starting to dim. The trail I'd hiked up seemed off. Different. I walked for a while without seeing any of the trail markers I remembered. One red, one yellow. Nailed into the bark at the fork. They'd helped guide me up. Now they were gone completely. I stopped, turned in a slow circle. Nothing looked familiar. I tried my phone. Zero signal, no GPS, no bars. The tower should have given me at least a weak line. I stayed put and pulled out the scanner, let it sweep, but caught something. A signal. Not anything I recognized. Not local radio, not emergency. Just repeating pulses. Evenly spaced, the waveform looked artificial, too uniform to be natural, but with glitches that made it feel like a bad imitation of something real. I followed the direction it came from. After maybe 5 minutes, the trees began to thin. I saw the road again, my car, right where I left it, the padlock still hanging on the gate. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just got in and drove straight back to Charleston.